So, without more ado, I'm going to ask, first of all, Guillermo Wilde to give his comments on the book. And I just want to say a few words about him. Of course, if you've been in Jesuit studies, you'll be aware of his name already. He's currently a senior researcher at Colonial in Buenos Aires and associate professor at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín. His research field is indigenous history of the Americas, colonial art and music, and also, of course, the history of the missions, particularly from a comparative perspective. And this is he's worked extensively on Jesuit missions, publishing in 2009, Religión y Poder en las Misiones Guaraníes, which was awarded the LASA Premio Iberoamericano Award, very prestigious award. And he's also written several articles on the Jesuit missions of South America, and recently published an edited volume, Saberes de la Conversión Jesuitas Indígenas Imperios Coloniales en las Fronteras de la Cristianidad, published in 2011. He's held a number of postdoctoral fellowships overseas, most recently at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. And currently, or I may have got these the wrong way around, he's currently Fernand Braudel Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. I may have got those two fellowships switched in terms of date, because I understand that Guillermo is in Germany at the moment. So we're really pleased to have Guillermo joining us, and really look forward to what he's going to say. So Guillermo, over to you.
Thank you, Linda, for this kind of presentation, and the first thank goes to you, of course, for this kind of invitation to comment on this new collection. I have to confess that the Jesuit worlds are, I would say, not a simple research topic for me, but a good opportunity, I think, to gather and catch up with colleagues and friends in the last, I would say, 15 years at least. So I am very happy to be here and to share this panel with Sabine, whose work I admire so much. There are many reasons to celebrate the publication of cultural worlds of the Jesuits in colonial Latin America. One of them is the fact that there is little literature in English about the activity of the Jesuits in colonial Latin America. Although some important studies, as you know, came out in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, it was not until the 2000 that this situation started kind of change. When a series of, I would say, monographic books based on the exhaustive study of different aspects of Jesuit missionary life began to come out. Just to mention some representative examples, we have the books by Barbara Ganson, by Sabine MacCormack, both of 2003. We have the book by Andrés Prieto, 2011, and Julia Sarrial and Miguel de Azúa, both in 2014. By contrast, the production in Spanish, Portuguese, and French language has been continuous and abundant in the last 2 decades, I would say, with several individual and collective publications, as well as a large number of theses defended in universities in Europe and the Americas on subjects as diverse as social, cultural and economic history, demography, linguistics, musicology, archaeology, and art history. Not to mention the numerous individual and collective works devoted to historical specific events, such as the expulsion of the Jesuits, the suppression of the Society of Jesus, and more recently the restoration of the order. I think this boom can be explained from different perspectives. One has clearly to do with the secularization of the field, and I think this is a very big issue. the secularization of the field of Jesuit studies, which until not so long ago was almost exclusively a property of the orders historians. Since the end of the 90s, many publications began to show an increasing openness to the secular world, let's say lay scholars. And as Linda Newson claims in the introduction of Cultural Worlds, the 2 volumes, The Jesuit Cultures, Sciences, and the Arts, based on meetings held at Boston College in the 90s, could be taken as a turning point, and I agree with that. And there is no doubt for me that a culmination of this process, let's say of secularization, to use a provocative word, is the recently published Oxford Handbook of the Jesuits, edited by Ines Supanov, where we find only a few Jesuits as authors. So something has gone on in the last, say, 15, 20 years in what, let's say, affiliation concerns. And as everybody knows, a distinctive mark of recent literature in the Jesuit field, for logical reasons, is its global orientation, which, as you know, especially grew in the framework of the so-called global term. And this produced a notorious, I think, a regional shift in the Jesuit field to the Atlantic, to the Pacific, and especially to the Asian world, I would say, with particular emphasis, as you know, on the charismatic figures of Matteo Ricci and Alessandro Valignano. So this produced, to my mind, 2 unintended effects. One of them is the deepening of the analytical separation between the action of the Jesuits in Latin America and in Asia. And I think that's not probably so artificial, I would say. But the other effect I find not so good in this, let's say, increase of the field is the dissolution of Latin America or the Latin American region in the dispersion and global, let's say, decentralization. So it seems to me that the book Cultural Worlds recovers this lost continental anchor. That I find really, really important. Since for most of the specialists on the Jesuits in colonial Latin America, the Jesuits are key actors in the construction, let's say, of Latin America. The Jesuits contributed in Latin America as probably nowhere else to the configuration of the territory and the formation of local societies. Latin America is a region where the order acquired decisive identity, both missionary and colonial. And this aspect can be observed from the first steps of the orders in Peru, in colonial Peru, as already shown by the works of Sabine MacCormack, Sabine Highland, and also Alyosha Moldavsky. So I think Cultural Worlds takes up the question of the missionary profile in several of its chapters, and I find that's really important for the scholarship on Latin America, on colonial Latin America. In those chapters, and I will mention probably the contribution of Ambrosio, also Ghelarducci, and Lessa Dessa and Egan, devoted to strategies of evangelization, but also the chapter of Boidan on the relationship between territory and linguistic production, and even the work on the configuration and distribution of musical practices by Leonardo Weissman, address this aspect in particular, the construction of missionary profile as an aspect of the orders identity constructed in the Americas, in Latin America. There, it can be clearly seen both the way the Jesuits order shapes the local and regional societies, economies, and cultures, and the way the other's profile is determined by the problems of the region, territory, administration, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, interaction with local societies, and their strange customs, which is particular to, it's not exclusive of Latin America, but it has singular aspects that contribute to the very definition of the Jesuit profile. Cultural worlds, and I will also use the short formula so that I don't tire you with repetitions, achieves a balance, I think, between the global dimension and the Latin American specificity, without falling into excessive localism and disciplinary specialization, which are, in fact, two trends common to many works on the region. Several chapters of the book provide a balanced treatment of the connections and circulations at different levels and from different materials. And I want to emphasize this fact, different materials and different levels. We have Chinese motifs in the Jesuit art of Brazil, treated by Goven Bailey. We have the American pharmacy in the European courts by Boumediene, the college missions and ranches in the continental let's say, traffic, treated by Clarence Smith, musical practices among diverse missionary spaces by Weisman, and printed and manuscripts in general languages in the chapter by Boisdan, Lesadessa, and Egan. It seems to me that cultural worlds represents in a very clear way the advances of a global, or let's say globalized, multicentric, literally connected academy, whose notes are to be found in the research made in different countries. So in the minutes I would like to put into dialogue some discussions the book raises with the general trends of the most recent production in Spanish and Portuguese language, pointing out some elements of confluence. I think confluence would be also a key word in this quick, let's say, overview. Confluence that I consider relevant in the consolidation of the field and in the definition of a possible future research agenda. So to be synthetic, I will consider three levels in which, as far as I am concerned, these confluences develop. We have the theoretical level, the methodological level, and what could be called the public level, or the public dimension. So let's go to the first. In the theoretical order, I think the recovery of the very concept of culture is strategic for the treatment of religious conversion. In a way, it encompasses what can be labeled as cultural turn in recent historiography, or probably not so recent, but a turn at the end. Let's say these trends or this shift to the global also is a cultural shift to the global, and not only economic as it used to be in the 70s or the 80s. And it includes, of course, the treatment of symbols and emotions, but also materiality and objects. In the first pages of the introduction, Linda defines conversion as a process implying transformations in all levels, which is also an assumption that is present in many of the chapters. So what are these levels? Let's say regimes of time and space, the organization of landscape, material life, cognitive mechanisms, etc. So conversion involves elements of imposition, but also of adaptation and appropriation, by individual subjects. And we have had, I think it's not necessary to go into detail, but as you know, we have had a big discussion on the concept of conversion or religious conversion as a cultural fact, both in history and especially in anthropology in the last 15 or 20 years. And many perspectives have been discussed. Because if we accept that a religious conversion is a cultural phenomenon, it's not clear how to approach it, how to analyze it. And at least two alternative solutions have been discussed in the anthropological literature of the last years. One is this idea, very fashionable idea, I would say, of Viveiros de Castro of analyzing the process of conversion as a structural openness to the other in a very Levi-Straussian fashion. But we also have a more processualist approach to conversion, emphasizing concepts such as mestizaje, ethnogenesis, middle ground, among other concepts, and one that is particularly strong in cultural words, that is transculturation, the traditional concept proposed by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz. So we have a big discussion here that is posed in a way or another in the book. And also, let's say, as a third alternative to those theoretical frameworks on conversion, the simple option of just going into the materials, the different kind of materials, and see what they have to say about transformations, about concrete mechanisms of transformations and adaptations, as musicologists do, but also as linguists or art historians do. We also have in the book, I think, an interesting discussion from different perspectives on the concept of indigenous agency, or indigenous agency as a fact. Although today is no longer a novelty to speak of indigenous agencies, it is for everybody and a starting point for any ethnohistory. The details of its concrete dynamics must necessarily be investigated. And I find in cultural worlds different strategies to deal with this aspect or the let's say the recovering of this dimension of agency. We have agency as open resistance to the adoption of Christian discourse and practices. We have also agency as the development of indigenous political and religious autonomy. And we also have some approach, I would say a shy approach to the emergence of gender-specific forms of agency, I think especially in the paper by Barbara Ganso. Now let's move to the second point, to the second, let's say, confluence I want to emphasize. And it is the methodological confluence. The field of Jesuit studies in Latin America has been marked in recent years by the discovery of new, very important sources. The main discoveries, I think, have been made in three areas. One is the finding of printed imprints and manuscripts in indigenous languages, more specifically the so-called general languages, which were not exactly the languages spoken by the Indians in the missionary context, but a construction, let's say, a grammatical construction made by the missionaries in interaction with the natives. And documents in general, this is the first big finding. Documents in general languages were decisive in the creation of the field of missionary written culture. As the chapters of Boisdan, Kogut Lesa de Sa, and Egan show, these are materials highly dispersed throughout the world, whose trajectory and material features deserve in-depth study. In any case, they confirm that the very process of Jesuit missionary territorialization, or let's say ethnogenesis, was based on linguistic homogenization. Probably nowhere else in the world did the Jesuits produce such a variety of linguistic materials. A paradigmatic example of this is the area that we could roughly call Tupi-Guarani. The initial corpus of such material has multiplied exponentially following the research of the Brazilian historian Eduardo Neumann, who wrote a book on indigenous literacy in the Guarani missions, the Japanese anthropologist Akira Saito on document management in the Mojos area, in the area of Mojos, and the transcriptions of Roberto Tomicha and Siglen de Falkinger in the Chiquitos area. This has recently led to work on the circulation of books, for example, and the formation of libraries, the translation of sermons and theological and moral treatises, forms of historical narrations by many young scholars and also research teams all over the world. Some recent findings also show the emergence, as Boisdan highlights, of genres of devotional literature in the general languages developed autonomously by the indigenous populations. The second set of materials I want to underline as a recent finding is manuscripts and books on medicine and botany, which signals phenomena that Samir Boumediene has very clearly identified in his chapter on the circulation of materias medicas, drugs, prescription, and apothecaries throughout the Atlantic, in which movement were central, of course, agents such as the procurators, but also configurations, connected Jesuit configurations all over the world of colleges, missions, and even pharmacies. And recently, at least 3 international projects are involved in the publication of the Natural History of Jesuit José Sánchez Labrador, as mentioned by more than one of the chapters in the book. So a big question, and this is a research agenda question that I think Cultural Works deals with, and a point of confluence with other research, is what is the nature of this missionary knowledge? How practical is it as specialists on the history of Jesuit science have underlined? But also we can raise the question about what is the place for curiosity in this missionary knowledge, generally identified with apology and edification. Is there any place for curiosity? And I think those are questions recently raised by specialists in the history of science. I also would add another question, that is, what is the role of indigenous traditions or knowledge of traditions in this production? So these are questions that are in the air, and I think Cultural Worlds clearly put them in discussion. I don't know, Linda, how long, how much time do I have? But I would add a third field of findings. Let's say primary sources finding that has been clearly defined a field of study in the last years, and that is the sources related to the Jesuit administration, to the internal Jesuit administration. That has been a dimension almost unknown until very recently, and this corpus, we can speak of a corpus because it's a different kind of materials. It has, for example, letters and memorials, books of precepts and consultations. Also, we have minutes of different types of congregations, connecting different layers of Jesuit authority, provincial, general, procurators, visitors, superiors. It's a kind of hidden register, I would say, and very important one, in which the Jesuits all over the world make nothing less than taking decisions. So the importance, the relevance of these materials to understand the process of the orders communications all over the world, and also the process of decision making, so important in the order, is clear. In these documents, each aspect of the political and economic administration of the Jesuit establishment was discussed. They reveal the internal workings of the order in terms of decision making, but above all, they show the tensions, the conflicts, the denouncement, even very serious denouncement, in fact, and that will resemble I would say, the colonial society of Jesus to current church. So we have denouncement and disagreements between the members of the orders, these materials allow us to understand especially the economic and the political administration of the Jesuits in the different establishments of the same province, and the connections with the Roman authorities, leading to a better understanding also of the way Jesuit territoriality was organized. The study of these documents may bring us, or may bring an answer, or a possible answer, to the question posed by Clarence Smith in his chapter, and it is how much of innovation or how much of management is there in the setting up of the Jesuit social and economic structure. I think many answers to these questions can be found in this type of source. Maybe there is both things, management and innovation. And the internal logic of these documents reveals the pragmatism and the decentralization of the Jesuit decision-making mechanism. I want to finish by mentioning some notes on what I call the public dimension. So I speak some of the theoretical, some of the methodological, but I think there are also public consequences on the discussion of the book and the general field of Jesuit studies in colonial Latin America, in colonial Latin America. And that is the place Jesuit sites occupy today in the imagination of and about Latin America, and the need, I would say also the demand, that currently exists to connect them to the problems of the present. Many of the practices introduced by, as you know, introduced by the Jesuit in Latin America continue to be very much alive after the expulsion, even forming part of the institutional life and daily routine of many peoples today. So it's a central aspect to dealing with local communities today. And these continuities over centuries still need to be addressed or to be analyzed but we still need to develop a methodology for that. The approach of two of the book's chapters, the more ethnographic ones by Kate Ford and Clarissa Ramayer, exploring the continuities and ruptures in the use of materials such as stone or body techniques associated with ceramic production from pre-Hispanic times to present, they provide useful insights to address the problem of continuity and survival in cultural transmission. And this type of treatment can have direct consequences on the production of public policies on memory, particularly in the area of cultural heritage and patrimony, no? Insofar as it allows for a rethinking of the objects and places of the past as dynamic flows of experience associated with contradictory appropriations. Anybody who visit today Chiquitos, Mojos, or any, I would say any place in the world, even southern Japan, I would say the region of the Goto Islands, would find these contradictory appropriations and representations involving local inhabitants, municipal authorities, international organizations such as the UNESCO, which is the more official. Similarly, and I finish with this, the influence of the Jesuits in the formation of independent states in Latin America, so the 19th century, the post-colonial, is, I think, a part of the colonial history of the order. It's a topic that has begun to attract the attention very recently, and it is a story that begins immediately after the expulsion of the Jesuits, as Furlong, Antonello Gerbi, David Brading, and other, also Cañizares Guerra, among others, have shown. The patriotic discourse begins with the so-called writings of the Italian exile. After the restoration of the order in 1814, the Jesuits concentrated mainly on educational and scientific activities rather than on missionary activities at the request of the independent government. And this would be their contribution to the formation of the Catholic intelligentsia in the emerging nations from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, as shown in the chapter by Eduardo Ortiz, the last chapter of the book on the case of Argentina. So in sum, I think cultural words takes the difficult challenge of connecting past and present as a final conclusion, I would say. And it also leaves open the question on how to think continuity and change from very fragmented evidence from many times over the long term. So I think I will stop here because I spoke a lot.
But it was wonderful. Thank you so much. That is just a fantastic overview of Jesuit studies, and but also building in the book that we've produced. I keep thinking I should have asked you to actually write the introduction, because you are much more of a Jesuit scholar than I am. So thank you very much. I'm sure that there'll be lots of comments and questions afterwards. But Sabine, can we ask Sabine to join us, and we'll come back to you in the question and answers. Sabine?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. I unmuted my...
Yes, right.
Can you see me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I think everyone can see you, and so over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the honor of asking me to speak today at the launch of this very important book. It's a pleasure to be with you. Guillermo's brilliant commentary is going to be a very hard act to follow. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Few other institutions. Actually, before I get started, I do have a PowerPoint, so let me get that up. There. Okay. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yes, yes, everyone's nodding. Okay, thank you. Few other institutions, as we know, have had a greater impact on Latin American culture than the Society of Jesus. Their legacy reverberates throughout the Americas even today. In education, economics, virtually every aspect of society they left their mark on. This exciting new book, edited by the renowned scholar Linda Newson, covers much of the breadth of how the Jesuits have shaped Latin American culture, from livestock breeding, a wonderful chapter on mules, to advances in astronomy in 20th century Argentina, to maintaining, there we go, to maintaining a global exchange network of exotic plants, to supporting patriarchal sexual mores, and to all aspects of mission life and evangelization: baptism, iconography, art, pottery making, music, the translation of indigenous languages, such as Guarani and Tupi, and norms for the spiritual education of Andean people. Reading through the book, it becomes clear to me anyway, that issues of language and of materiality form one of the dominant themes. And we see here just a list of amazing chapters, and I apologize that there wasn't time to talk about everyone's chapter. But you see themes of language, for example, in Baudin's, how she demonstrates how the Jesuits created a lingua franca to aid evangelization that's used today. Virginia Gerlarducci discussed how the Jesuits used their missions in Juli and El Cercado for Christian evangelization. The suitability of the Tupi languages is addressed. Bailey looks at the Chinese art style in Brazil. Other aspects that focus on materiality are the looking at image and performance in Chiquitos, specifically how decorations on Chiquito churches repeated local indigenous motifs that offered protection from harm. Ramier investigates the different Jesuit and Guarani techniques for pottery production, exploring the degree of assimilation and accommodation. And Boumediene reveals the networks that undergirded the Jesuit acquisition and exchange of exotic plants and other materials. Linda asked me today to address how my own research on Jesuit evangelization expands on the themes of this volume. And so I'd like to speak this afternoon very briefly about the conjunction of language and materiality in Jesuit missions in the Colonial Andes, which I've been studying. And this perhaps would fit Guillermo's idea of new sources, particularly quipus and pictographic manuscripts. It's not well known that the Jesuits manipulated quipus, the Andean three-dimensional knotted and colored cords, for use in evangelization. Since at least 800 AD, Andean peoples employed quipus for keeping economic and demographic records, as well as for recording history, biography, and other narratives. When the Jesuits arrived in Peru, their missionaries encouraged indigenous converts to use quipus for memorizing Christian prayers, as well as for confessing sins. Okay. And one of the things that's notable about the Jesuits' use of quipus is that they added elements to the quipus to express Christian theological notions. So, for example, other orders who used quipus in catechism as well had basic color schemes where, say, red indicated adultery, white indicated blasphemy, and so on. Well, the Jesuits used that as well, but they added a whole level of theological sophistication to the quipus. In 1602, Father Cabredo sent a letter to General Aquaviva in which he described how one of the that included threads spaced along it, as well as some signs of stone or bone or feathers conforming to the materia of the sin being confessed. Now, the materia of the sin relates to the act that it consisted of, and which is judged to be either mortal or venial. Jesuit catechetical materials in the Colonial Andes emphasized the potential for thoughts to be venial sins, although of a lesser degree than actual venial deeds. if the tripartite division of bone, stone, and feathers that was tied onto the quipus, onto the Andean quipus, represents the material of the sins, as the text states, then it's most likely that this refers to whether a sin was mortal, so you put a bone on the quipu, on the cord, show it was mortal, or a feather to show it was a very light venial sin, probably of thought, or a stone to show a more serious venial deed. Okay. It's unclear whether a Jesuit priest taught the confessor to indicate the severity of sins by using this tripartite classification, or whether the confessant did so on his own initiative. Either way, it certainly reflects Christian teaching. Okay. Prior to the Spanish invasion, Andean peoples did occasionally attach items to quipus, but they obviously didn't categorize them according to scholastic inventions. In fact, pre-Columbian quipus with feathers are known to exist, although the feather symbolism is unclear. Here we have such an example. When I shared this image with an Andean friend of mine, an elderly woman who's very astute and wise, and who comes from a highland village that treasures its own quipus and a secret ritual space, she thought she knew what the feathers indicated. She said that they actually represent particular lineages, ayus, and the ancestors that descend from specific birds associated with supernatural beings. I don't know if she's correct or not, but one wonders what was understood by the Jesuit's confessant when he tied feathers to the cords. Was he thinking of the insubstantial nature of minor venial sins? Or perhaps the feathers were used to demonstrate sins associated with lineage ancestors. The feathers on confessional quipus get at the heart of what you can consider the translation dilemma in Jesuit evangelization. This is the ubiquitous problem of how to create a language that can convey the truth of the Christian faith that is understandable in native terms, yet does not propagate so-called idolatries, if you want to call them that. Many of the chapters in this new volume directly address this dilemma. This translation dilemma is even more apparent in the pictographic catechisms known in the Andes from the 18th to the 20th centuries. It's commonly believed, most scholars believe, that it was the Jesuits who first introduced pictorial catechisms into the Andes in the colonial period. They're similar to the so-called Testerian catechisms of colonial Mexico, only in the most general sense. The Andean pictographic texts have their own iconography, one that's very different from that of Central America. Andean pictographic catechisms represent Christian prayers like the Our Father, the Creed, and the Confiteor, along with numbered texts such as the 10 Commandments, the 5 Commands of the Church, the 7 Sacraments, and so on. And these numbers are really important in trying to figure out what prayer is being represented. However, few of the older catechisms that exist have been fully translated, and most contain texts and symbols that can no longer be interpreted. Okay. An Argentine scholar, Dick Ibarra-Grasso, undertook the first extended study of these pictographic catechisms in the 1940s, collecting ones from southern Peru, Lake Titicaca, and elsewhere in Bolivia. The pictographic tradition apparently died out in the Lake Titicaca region by the 1960s. However, it continued in southern Bolivia until the 1980s, where anthropologist Walter Sanchez conducted fieldwork. It's been my good fortune to be working on the Pickering catechisms. These are 2 of the oldest pictographic catechisms in existence and have never been studied before by anyone. In fact, these are the first times these images have been shown to the public. These are pictures that were taken by my doctoral student, Manny Medrano. A Harvard astronomer, Dr. William Pickering, collected these 2 hides, they're probably goat hide, from Lake Titicaca in the 1890s. And the specific style of the images show that they were made on the island of the moon. Ibarra-Grasso had published several drawings he made of Island of the Moon catechisms, but the originals have disappeared, and no other catechisms from this island are known to exist. While it is thought that the Jesuits they initiated this type of pictographic writing in the Andes, it's clearly been passed down among the indigenous populations. The anthropologist Adolphe Bandelier, who conducted research on the neighboring island of the Sun in the 1890s, wrote, "Some of the Indians still preserve a kind of picture writing. It is very difficult to obtain such pictographs. The Indians refuse even to exhibit them, and our tenders of money could not induce them to show us one of these curious pictographs. Their import is wholly religious. They are the catechism and church prayers pictorially represented. And if you look at them, if you look through the image on your screen, you should see, I can't really point it out, I don't have a pointer, but you should see some eyes along the way. It's kind of an eye with eyelashes and a dot in the middle. That indicates the beginning of a prayer, and it's a rebus, because the word for eye, nyawi, is very similar for the word for beginning in both Quechua and Aymara. So that's a common rebus that you find. Okay. We're talking about images of sin. If you look at this little image here, you can see very clearly the group of saved people going up to heaven, led by an angel. And at the bottom, there are the people who are damned, who are going, below to where you don't want to go. And they're all wearing bundles on their back. In these images, it's very common to show sinners as having a bundle on their back. Okay. But you also find native Andean images in this pictography. For example, this little phrase indicates the cross on the plinth means literally the all-powerful God, because the cross is God and the plinth is an expression of power. It's like the Andean Ushnu. And then the man hunched over, the elderly man, is God the Father. Then you have God the Son, kind of sprightlier, holding his cross. And then the Holy Spirit is represented by a condor. Now, of course, doves exist in the Andes, but they chose not to use a dove to represent the Holy Spirit, but a condor, which is very interesting, of course. Condors play important roles, even continue to play important roles in Andean beliefs. They have the power to foretell the future. I've been involved in ceremonies where the condors are released in order to predict the year's harvest. They can represent the sky and the upper world, and also the sun. They're also the quintessential bad son-in-law in Andean mythology. And I wonder about the images that show the Virgin Mary, the Annunciation, which is announced by the Holy Spirit. In fact, she's standing next to a condor, who's the agent of her impregnation, I guess. I don't know quite how to put it. One wonders, anyway, what such images mean. Well, thank you for listening. The point I'm trying to get at is that I think most of us understand the degree to which the Jesuits excelled at cultural accommodation. And that's a theme that occurs over and over and over in this book, these beautifully described examples of that. And my question is if we could go further than the book goes and start to argue about what the implications are this. So, for example, many of my colleagues in anthropology will view the type of cultural accommodation as, in fact, a colonization of consciousness, a way of making hegemonic imperial control more complete. So, in fact, it's even more, in a sense, oppressive than simple campaigns to extirpate idolatry. On the other hand, one could have a viewpoint, that the acculturation that the Jesuits pursued altered the trajectory of European forms of Christianity and culture. And so we see examples, you can think of, bringing Asian art into other parts of the world. Medicine, theology is really a reciprocal evangelization. I should also mention, again, Guillermo's comments earlier were absolutely wonderful and fascinating. When we talk about anthropological notions of conversion and kind of the development of the anthropology of Christianity in the last 15 years, one of the most common themes, of course, is a rejection of even the possibility of conversion. And I think a lot of anthropologists have recently become very critical of the discourse in the anthropology of Christianity because it's so heavily influenced and focused on Protestant evangelical and fundamentalist understandings of what conversion is. There's kind of this instantaneous, transformation of everything, and that bringing Catholic models in, I think, has the possibility of seeing this in perhaps greater complexity. Okay, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabina. First of all, I owe you a terrific apology in that I didn't introduce you at the beginning. If I had, I would have, of course, given your affiliation as Professor of World Christianity at the University of St Andrews, and said that you were an anthropologist and ethnohistorian. You've done extensive field work in the Andes, and you've demonstrated this so clearly with your presentation tonight. And you've also done a lot of work on Jesuit texts as well. So, like Guillermo, you're really, the right people to comment on the book. And thank you for posing these fundamental questions at the end, which I think a lot of scholars struggle with, and follows up so well from Guillermo's comments before. To open up the floor to questions from anybody, we have quite a number of people who contributed to the volumes. I can't recognize everybody here because people sometimes don't use their own name. But there, I think, Barbara might be here. Barbara Ganson. I have a Barbara, Caroline Egan, and I know Virginia's here. There's quite a lot of people. I can't see all of them at the moment, but many of the contributors might wish to comment or make any comments, and others may pick up on, very important questions that both these scholars have posed. I should say I feel I'm terribly humble in this position because I myself am not really a Jesuit scholar. I've never worked essentially on the Jesuits. I have used Jesuit sources, but I've never studied the Jesuits as such. And it was through touching on the different fields in which I came into contact with them that I became interested in the Jesuits and all of the different things that they did in terms of dictionaries, in terms of medicines and such like, which was the idea that I had for the conference. But myself, I have never written anything specifically really on the Jesuits. So I feel very humble in the face of all these wonderful papers that people have contributed to this volume, and I'm very, very grateful to those who attended the conference and also contributed. I should mention that Sabina was also going to hopefully be joining the conference. It didn't quite work out like that. Certainly she was on our list of people to join. I might just add that one thing that's me in the volume which I would have liked and we hope to cover was cartography. And Domingo Ledesma was actually at the conference and also was going to contribute something on Samuel Fritz and the mapping of the Upper Amazon, but unfortunately, for personal reasons, was unable, to do that. So I think it would have been, that's a part of the Jesuits, endeavours, which isn't covered in the book. But I think we've touched on lots of other things that hopefully people will find interesting. So the floor is open. If you can raise your hand, and I will invite you to speak as so. So Jorge Salgado said he wants to tell us how the digitization process is going. Is this the work that Sabine is talking about? Hi, Jorge, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I am here. Sorry, and I'm going to put my, okay. Hey, I'm Jorge Salcedo from Colombia. Yeah, hi. Thank you for the book and for the presentation today. Yeah, I'm very interested to ask many questions about, because we are doing a research here. We have a big archives, plenty of sources from the colonial period. And I would like to introduce you, all the scholars, all the researchers here in this conference, wonderful conference, that we are doing the digitalization of these archives. It's from the colonial period. And it will be very nice to present to you, because it's a kind of it's an amazing font of sources. For instance, about different scholars that they work during the viceroyal, and then we have a kind of different grammars, how the Jesuits work in different parts of New Kingdom of Granada. And talking about the grammars, I think they produce a wonderful grammar of the Latin native people here in Bogota, around Bogota, nearby Bogota. And it will be very amazing to know that we are doing this work in here. I am in Bogota right now, and thank you for presenting and for giving this wonderful lecture. I think if you need my help with the sources, I'm the coordinator of this project here in the Javeriana University, and I will invite you to discuss, because we have a mind of resources here in New Kingdom of Granada during the colonial period. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. It was very amazing, Sabina. Thank you for your presentation. And Guillermo, we met maybe some years ago and in Mexico, but yeah, you are very welcome to ask questions about New Kingdom of Granada. We have a wonderful archives here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. And Jorge's left his email address if anyone wants to contact him in the chat. Has anyone else got a question? Any of the contributors to the volume? Or anyone wish to comment particularly on the business, the questions that Sabine raised at the end, and which actually Guillermo also has done, about the nature of conversion, the process, and what that actually represents. You know, is it the exertion of power in a more subtle way? Let me see. Is anyone? We've in the chat. We've also got, if you want, a link to the discount for the book if you'd like to buy it. I would say it's quite a handsome book. With lots of coloured pictures as well. I know you will see it on the website, but you may wish to get a copy as well. Unmute message, right? Okay. So, Guillermo, please ask.
Thank you.
Guillermo Candela.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with friends, and it's very interesting talk. Just a question for both of you, Guillermo and Sabine, about the interest of current indigenous people about these corpus or these document quipus. If you remark some interest or from the current indigenous people around the Latin America.
Yes. Hi. That was a great question. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. My experience is that most of the people with whom I've worked in communities that maintain their patrimonial quipus care very deeply about them. I've worked in one community where there had been a lack of interest, but in most cases, yeah, this is something that people care about a lot. I've worked with the Peruvian Ministry of Education in putting together online lesson plans about quipus, and that's gone really well. When my husband and I were in one community last summer, where they still maintain their patrimonial quipus. They're actually 18th century quipus. And the lesson plan is about this. And the school teacher, because we had to go to the village assembly and present our interest in our work, the school teacher stood up and she said, you know, the little kids don't want to go to school until I show them that their village is like known by all of Peru now. And then they care. I mean, that's a silly example, but yeah, people have a lot of interest. I think one of the reasons why the Andes can be an easy place to work is because there's a strong discourse among Native people about cultural patrimony, and there's an interest in letting the world know kind of about what they have. So that's what I find.
Guillaume, I think someone that would be able to better answer this question would be the authors that work more ethnographically, because in a way this question you raise has to do with let's say temporal continuity, and two of the essays of the book are really interesting in the way they deal with this long-term, very long-term continuity in techniques, in the use of materials. And there, I think we have something that may, in a way, escape to a strict, let's say, a focus of colonial Latin American studies, but in a way, it also touch it. And it is how memory is updated and recycled over the long term. If you go to places such as Mojos and Chiquitos, and maybe also southern Chile, the region of Chiloé, you will find that many institutions that were, in a way, imposed by the Jesuits in the region, I mean administrative fiscals, for example, or even confraternities, are still continuing with their symbols, their even rituals over so many years. In the regions of Chiquitos and Mojos, they kept and copied sermons and religious materials for decades, and they kept them in their own houses. So in the problem of when analyzing, let's say, the continuities over the long term, I think we have some key elements in I think the articles by Kate Ford, if I'm not mistaken, that suggest to emphasize the role of the domestic sphere, let's say, in the conservation, in the preservation of, let's say, these religious traditions. So at that level, at the domestic level, at the level of the household, you will be able to find a strong degree of continuity over the long term, which also speaks, of course, of the role of women in this process, I would say, which is not explicit in the book, but I think it's a good thing to mention.
Thank you. I think Alejandra has a question. Alejandra?
Yes, Linda, thank you. Thank you very much. Oops, sorry. Thank you for having me, and congratulations to you and for putting together such an interesting book. I'm already filing the offer. Needless to say, I am completely alien to the field. I'm learning a lot, and I love Sabine and Guillermo's comments. And I really have a question to all of you as specialists. It's a little bit a vested question, because I'm at the very moment reviewing an article on the Jesuits for a hardcore economic history journal. And it's very much what Guillermo was saying. It's such a fascinating subject that is even attracting the attention of these hardcore economic historians. Now, the article I'm reviewing is about numeracy as a proxy for human capital that these historians, many already have proven, the Jesuit developed in the missions. Now, the question I have for all of you is if there are specific features or qualities or virtues of the Jesuits in the Warning missions, and to what extent this is comparable or can be traced in other missions, particularly in Peru and the Californias. Or if you can, suggest something that I can read and learn more. Sabine mentioned astronomy. Guillermo talk about literacy. So I'm really very thirsty to learn more. So I'd like to hear from you that you know better than me. Thank you very much.
Okay, Guillermo or Sabine, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Alejandra. In fact, we have to talk about that article, in fact. But I think the question you raise is very important for the future agenda of research. In the last, I would say, I don't know, yes, at least 20 years, the research agenda has been especially focused in trying to understand the local dynamics, let's say also regional dynamics of specific regions. And we still have a very, very little work of comparison, I would say. And you will find generally in, let's say, in works trying to make comparison, in general, in spite of some exceptions, of course, very unbalanced, I would say, try, in the sense that especially that wants to compare, generally knows very well one area and not so well the other. So we have to deal with that, and I think that's part of the current agenda of research. If there is, if there are specific features that characterize the Guarani missions, in particular, by comparison to others, I mean that's a big question that could be, could be answered taking different missionary initiatives in one moment of time. But I think a better option is to see the evolution, let's say, the evolution over the long term of this missionary, let's say, experiment. I don't like so much the word, but there was there is some teleology in dealing with these missions, in which many historians have said, well, the Jesuits have really in mind from the very beginning how to deal with the Indians in the lowlands, and this successful experiment was already in a way present when they came to Peru at the end of the second half of the 16th century. But what we really find is that they, if they had a success in that region, was because contingent, let's say, contingent factors that still need to be studied. I mean, there are circumstances, local, regional, and global, that made that experiment in a way successful. So I think my option would be more following or reconstructing the whole historical process with all its contingencies, more than comparing side by side mission experiments. Well, I think I didn't answer so well.
No, that's thank you.
This seems another question from Nicholas about Nicholas Athindoro about methodology. Is Nicholas still here? Nicholas? Trying to find. Yeah. Nicholas? He's still here with us. Okay. Oh, sorry, Mike. Nicholas says his mic is not working. Okay. Okay, so the question was that he was posing his interest in the methodology used in the writing of the books and chapters as a student of historical methods. Guillermo mentioned cultural turn and global approaches, specifically what methods of historiography are used in these chapters and which best can describe the changes over time. That sounds like an exam question.
That was
Guillermo.
for you, Linda, I think, not for me.
Well, there was no. I perhaps should have explained before, for those of you, that this book grew out of a conference which I organised just as I was interested in the topic, and so the papers that we had were very eclectic, and so what you have before you are the people who offered papers. So I wasn't imposing any particular sort of approach or methodology. And as I said, I'm not a Jesuit scholar. So in a sense, it's I can't answer that question. But I think the things that struck me reading it, and I have to say, I think the book, and I shouldn't say this because I edited it, and it sounds like blowing your own horn, but I had very little to do with it. And I had to read, of course, all the chapters. And if you read them cover to cover, they really are fascinating. They cover such an enormous range of topics. And I learned a huge amount. What I drew out of that, the things that I found were many of the things have already been mentioned here, are the sort of transnational operations of the Jesuits, which come through on a number of papers. And the thing I was not so aware of was the degree to which the Jesuits teaching actually transformed language, i.e. the linguistic side. I actually used dictionaries myself, Jesuit dictionaries, in some of my work on diseases, but I was never really aware of the extent to which the development of Tupi-Guarani, for example, owed so much to the way that the Jesuits actually taught it. And then the other thing that sort of impressed on me, I wasn't so aware of the idea of which I should have been, the idea of the Jesuits being sort of accommodating and assimilating. And I'd always had this rather impression, I suppose, of the Jesuits of having very strict education and trying to impose their own views on people. And I wasn't aware until I read many of these papers how actually accommodating they were. Now, I mean, that does raise ethical questions, as Guillermo said towards the end. Maybe this accommodation is actually a way of a more effective way of achieving power over people. But nevertheless, it did, I think, produce some very interesting sort of cultural artifacts. I've just a little sort of anecdote I'll tell you, which was many years ago, and I think I may have been a PhD student, and I didn't know much about Jesuits at all, but I did go to a seminar that was given by Nicholas Kushner, who was, as many of you know, a Jesuit, worked extensively, wrote many books on the Jesuits, and finally actually left the Jesuit order. And so it's interesting the comment that Guillermo made about the secularization of writing. But in that seminar, he said, you know, these people, these priests who went out, particularly to the missions, he said, I would regard them probably like today's dropouts. These were people in the 60s who dropped out and went traveling. They were looking for something different. They were looking to sort of escape a lot of this sort of hierarchy and tradition in Spain. Now, I know that doesn't go for all of them, because I know such a small proportion of the Jesuits actually ended up working in the mission fields. Most of them did stay within the cities. But nevertheless, I thought that it was very interesting that he said that. And at that time, he was a Jesuit. So those were the sorts of things that I drew, you know, from my reading. And as I said, I've learned a lot, and I've learned more today from Guillermo and Sabine's talk. So I'm skipping out of that question, I'm afraid. Any more questions? Or comments? Hisukli, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you. First, Sabine, thank you very much. Your pictogram reminds me of Sami drum in northern part of Scandinavia. They use the same pictogram, indigenous people, but they have so many reindeer. So the difference is they have reindeer, but you can compare with the pictogram in the Sami drum and all this feather. My question to you is first speaker, please see me. First speaker, you mentioned about the Jesuit in Asia and China, but how about the Philippines? How about Indonesia? Because they are also in Asia too. And Jesuit in Philippines, they came from Mexico, while in Indonesia, Jesuit came from Portugal. So I wonder whether you have thought about that. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I can comment on that a little bit. I mean, Guillermo might know more than me, but I did also I wrote a book on the Philippines, and in which I actually looked at well, the four religious orders who worked in the Philippines. One of them, of course, was the Jesuits, and as part of that, I learned much more about obviously the Philippines, but also the connections that they had with China. And in the period I was working, the difficulties that they had getting through to China, and many of them, in fact, were martyred when they tried to visit. So it was very closed at that time. But there is quite, I mean, obviously some work, I suppose, in the book. The work by Govan Bailey, I mean, talks about the Jesuits and the Jesuits in China, and how in this particular case the artwork was sort of transferred, if you like, and to churches in Brazil. But yes, I mean, I think I think this is a new area. I was fortunate to co-supervise a PhD student who was Chinese. And basically she was also working on the religious orders, but of course she had the advantage, which I don't have, of having the Chinese language. So she was actually using Chinese sources as well as being a fluent Spanish speaker. And so I think that is an area, particularly in Asia, which will grow probably in the future, as I think we get also this more of a sort of transnational turn in scholarship. Any
Can I add something to your remark, to your answer, Linda?
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know whether, because when I was taking notes on the books, I thought of this. let's say the extension of the geographical extension covered by the book. And I was wondering now, after Hee-Suk Lee question, the problem of dealing, I think Latin Americans have frequently the problem of whether to include or not the Philippines, in the sense that if we speak of the Philippines, we should speak speak more precisely about the Hispanic world more than the Latin American world. So I think in this sense, the framework, the regional framework of the book is very clear. But at the same time, when speaking of the Jesuits circulation, and let's say also Jesuits territoriality, we find the problem of how this continues, this territoriality is, in the sense that, for example, the Jesuit province, let's say the mission in the Philippines was ruled by the province of New Spain, and we have similar problems of administration, let's say, of Jesuit establishments that are not implying, let's say, a continuous territoriality from the geographical point of view. So just to
yeah. Yes, so someone who's worked in both areas on a similar topic, actually integrating the two is quite difficult, I have to say. I know there are scholars who do that. Maybe the questions that they ask would be different, but it isn't always easy. You are dealing with very, very different, indigenous context, shall we say, in which a lot of things actually happen, in terms of the natures of cultures and languages and everything. I think we're almost coming to the end of our time. Any more questions? If not, I just want to have a few more thanks on the way. I want to obviously thank our two speakers tonight. It's wonderful. And also for you to asking questions. I want to, in terms of the administration, I wanted to just thank Olga Jimenez, who was involved in organising the original conference. I really want to thank 4 colleagues in the University of London Publications who have produced this wonderful looking volume. It is indeed very handsome. So Emily Morel, Kerry Whitston, Jamie Bowman and Lauren Diath. So thank you all, publications team. You've done a great job. I think that's probably it. Hopefully you've made some connections with some people tonight, and there's certainly quite a lot of things to think about. Whether if we came from 10 years from now, we'd have a very different set of papers, but I'm not sure I'll be around then, but it would be very interesting to see how the subject actually develops. So thank you all once again, and have a good evening.